Our next presenter will shift the focus to the on-premise market and discuss top-line trends and how the wine category can be revived in this important channel. I'd like to welcome James Phillips, Head of BevAi, APAC at Nielsen IQ.
Great. Can everyone hear me there? Yep. Yeah, really excited to be here, and thanks for your time and having me to present today. It's not BevAi, but BevAi, so I would like to be thinking a bit more into the future about how we approach artificial intelligence with understanding the wine category. But yes, we're really all focused on the alcoholic beverage industry, Nielsen IQ. And a really important part of that for us is the on-premise. So today I'm going to take you through a couple of elements of the on-premise. One, a bit of an outlook into what's happening in this channel. We think it's a really important channel in terms of how you as suppliers build brands in a market, and particularly in Australia. So we'll give you a bit of an update on that. And then also just thinking about, I guess, the challenges that we've seen. There's always opportunities, right, that sort of come off the back of that. So how do we sort of revive the wine category in Australia and capitalise on some of those opportunities in the on-premise as well? So today, all our data is coming from consumer research, I guess a bit different to the Endeavour team with the sales data. So really this is all respondents of surveys that we run twice a year in Australia that deep dives into the on-premise. It's from our on-premise user survey. We look at 4,000 Australian consumers twice a year, and we've been doing this in Australia since 2022. We look at general behaviour, so consumption over the last 3 months when we do the survey, and this fieldwork was from March, April this year. And we have a nationally representative survey. We do quotas by age, gender, and the regions as well. And so this gives us a really in-depth coverage into the different on-premise channels, the categories that play in this space, the occasions, and also even down to a brand level. I think the really interesting thing today as well was a lot of what we're seeing from Endeavour and from Paul's piece earlier also resonates in the on-premise. So a lot of these things I don't think will be news today. But hopefully what we can give you is a bit more of an understanding of that consumer mindset on why they're making these choices, and therefore also how you can strategically approach this channel to grow your brands as well. So I'll start with, I guess, the on-premise outlook, how consumers are using the on-premise as well, because it is quite a unique channel. So I guess the on-premise, it's experienced a bit of a drop in visitation levels over the past year. I think we saw a big amount of sort of revenge spending out in the on-premise after the pandemic. A lot of growth of people going out and visiting post-pandemic, a lot of trapped savings that they were willing to get back out and experience that. But since then we've seen, I guess, a slight drop in visitation. Nothing, I guess, to be really sort of panic stations about. But, it is down in terms of the number of people going out there. I think the real positive sign, though, is the frequency of visitation, though. We look at different cohorts of visitors to this channel, and we consider what's called sort of weekly visitors, or people who visit more than once a week, as sort of high-frequency visitors. I think the really positive thing on the on-premise is there's about 50% of the consumers in our survey that say they are weekly visitors to this channel. So they're out there engaging with the channel, engaging with your brands in this channel as well, and building a really strong relationships within the channel as well. And the cool thing is, I guess, for the on-premise is that frequency, or those high-frequency consumers, are up significantly on last year, so up 5 percentage points since half 1 2024 in our consumer data. And it's pretty broad-based as well. So, the big eastern seaboard states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, all up. You can see how their New South Wales is over-indexing versus that high-frequency number across total Australia. And then also in all of the age demographics that we sort of group it into as well. So that frequency is really positive in terms of, I guess, the high visitation levels of those people that are still going out, and I guess sort of balances out those total sort of visitation numbers across the Australian industry. But what we are seeing on the other side, so it's sort of a bit up, a bit down across the board, is a real change in intensity. And there's been a lot of conversations today about the types of occasions that people visit for, and it is very much an occasion-led channel, the on-premise. So where we're seeing decreases in the average number of drinks consumed in on-premise is from these high-intensity channels. So high-tempo drinks, watching live sports. In these occasions in the on-premise, people are drinking less serves per occasion. And then we seem to see sort of relatively similar levels across the more low-energy occasions, but actually some of the occasions that are more wine-focused as well. Those high-intensity, high-tempo drinks, watching live sports typically aren't where you see a huge amount of consumption in wine. Not many people are going out to a nightclub and saying, I'll have a glass of Shiraz at 12 o'clock at night. So it is interesting for the dynamics of wine and how that plays out. But this is what we're seeing across the total on-premise. It's a bit of a busy slide, so bear with me. On the left-hand side, really we've got share of visits to our primary channels that we consider. And then on the right-hand side, it's share of visits to the primary occasions we look at in the on-premise. So both the channel type and the occasions and what takes up the lion's share of visitation. And we calculate that through multiplying essentially that penetration level by the frequency there. And so what you can see are, in the channels that people visit, casual dining restaurants, that yellow group, pubs, RSLs, sports clubs. These are sort of the dominant channels from a visitation level that we see in Australia. But where we have seen changes negatively is in these channels as well. So casual dining is down year on year in terms of that share of visits, and also in that sort of RSL sports club environment as well. So these kind of casual occasions in the on-premise. Surprisingly, we're seeing a bit of growth in the bar, late night share of occasions, and also the nightclub area as well. So it's interesting that they're reducing overall consumption and occasions that are more geared to that space in terms of number of drinks, but we're seeing a higher increase of visits to these channels. And I think that's really positive for the industry. We've seen a few years of these types of channels really losing share of visitation. And I think there's probably some changes structurally in how people are getting back into the, working in the office and that return into sort of more metro CBD locations where we're seeing some of that influencing that channel visitation as well. We've talked for a number of years about days of the week and how Thursdays were becoming the new Friday in the on-premise. And some of this seems to be reversing a bit. And then over to the sort of the occasions we look at, again, these bigger share of visit occasions, casual meals, relaxed, quiet drinks, after-work drinks are sort of the lion's share of it. And to that theme of the return to work or return to office mandates we're seeing in various industries, we're seeing a positive increase in that share of visits for those after-work drinks, those more impulsive, after-work drinks that you see in that space, yet the special occasion is down, that primary special occasion. So there's a bit going on there as well. So that sort of gives you a view, of that kind of overall shift in the types of visitation levels that we're seeing. And if we expand it out, another really busy slide, again, we look at not just those primary occasions, but a breakdown of all the occasions we look at across the on-premise. And we sort of broadly break it into three big buckets. We've got event-led occasions, drink-led and food-led. I think the food-led's pretty clear, a visit to a restaurant for dinner, a casual dining venue. Those are all kind of the casual meal. Those kind of visitations are pretty clear. I think the events are really interesting ones. So that special occasion one, which we saw was down in terms of share of visits, but also things like to watch live sport, a ticketed event, live music. These are now the largest share of visits in occasions in the Australian on-premise, which is really interesting because it shows a real intentionality to go out for the on-premise visit. There's a very a sort of a highly planned occasion as well. These events typically are. And in the last 2 years, we've seen this grow 5 percentage points, really in place of what we see as sort of those food-led occasions. So there's also, I guess, a need for increased experience from consumers in the on-premise. Just going out for a dinner with a wine with friends might not be enough for people in the on-premise. They're looking for something else in that space as well. I guess positive for drink-led occasions, that's also up in the last year. But really where the big shift is happening is between those event and food-led occasions. And finally, on this kind of overall on-premise, a bit hard to see, I think, some of the occasion share changes on this slide. I think the formatting's been changed a bit, but where we're seeing the growth, again, those after-work drinks, in-venue events, so those planned kind of casual events like a quiz or bingo, and then where we're seeing it drop down is kind of that quick bite to eat and that special occasion. And I think for the special occasions, it's things like birthdays, celebrating anniversaries, these types of things that we're seeing a decrease in the on-premise overall. So I think a mixed bag, a really interesting change in the dynamics of what's happening in general in the on-premise. I wouldn't say it's doom and gloom in any way. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to get the strategy of your brands right for how you activate, invest in this channel as well. It seems like that plan, that intentional consumption would really lean towards how do you do fewer, bigger, better investments into things like customer marketing with your partners in this space. And less maybe sort of always on, themes around special occasions or those kind of low intentionality, those more impulsive occasions as well. So that's the on-premise. But I wanted to also dive deeper into wine. Obviously, we're here to talk about Wine Australia today, Australian wine and the Australian wine industry. And also, how do we overcome some of these kind of current challenges we're seeing? How do we sort of revitalise this category specifically from an on-premise perspective? So about 38% of consumers, Australian consumers, consume wine in the on-premise. The difficult challenge here is this has decreased over the last couple of years since 2022, and it's sort of stagnated from about 41% of consumers in the on-premise to now 38%. So this is the challenge, right? You've got less people out there consuming in the on-premise, consuming wine. But it's not just wine that this is happening to. Really traditional categories in Australia in the on-premise have seen declines in that consumption. So beer, spirits and wine have all seen decreases since 2023 in that number of people consuming those categories in the on-premise. And we're seeing, I guess, the innovation in categories beyond these traditional categories, things like alcoholic ginger beer, RTDs and premix, which the Endeavour team talked about. The growth of these types of categories and no low alternatives really increasing and taking, I guess, some of that share from other categories. So it's not just a wine challenge; it's a broader industry challenge, and there are new competitive threats. There's new innovative threats coming from different categories in the on-premise. And to go into sort of the demographics, which I think is really important to see where the consumers are engaged, which consumers are engaged with drinking wine. Obviously, the older plus 55 generation, the most engaged with wine in the on-premise. And that's very typical, I guess, what we see of broader Australia. 18 to 34-year-olds is a challenge, right? And that sort of typical journey of how do they get educated and involved with wine. But I guess the most concerning is that sort of mid-group of 35 to 54-year-olds. The typical journey as you learnt more about wine was you become more and more engaged with it. And this is a generation that is, drinking less and less wine over the last couple of years, particularly in the on-premise. And, there are a lot of factors in this, the moderation trend, recent cost of living challenges, and then also that competitive threat, But we can dive a bit deeper into, I guess, some of those barriers that we're seeing for younger generations as we go through the slides. I think the other concerning thing about this, when we look at the frequency breakdown of these different generations, those high frequency visitors are much more likely to be that 18 to 34-year-old. And it's so interesting that this group of consumers is the high-frequency visitor, considering their incomes are much smaller than that sort of group of 35 to 50-year-olds, 54-year-olds and 55 plus, right? But I guess their share of discretionary income that they can spend in this channel, they don't have necessarily mortgages or children to look after, is much higher. So they choose to spend it in the on-premise quite frequently as well. So they're a key demographic that you have to sort of win to be successful in the on-premise. And, you know, some of this echoes, I guess, what we were seeing before in the Endeavours presentation. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into varietal, but what we have seen is very similar to that growth in sort of sparkling wine, particularly through Prosecco and the spritz trend, whereas champagne's been a bit more muted. And that's where I guess some of the positive signs in, I guess, innovation in the wine industry is sort of flowing through into the on-premise as well. Dessert, sweet wine, maybe that, easier to engage with palate for younger consumers has also been improving as well over the last 2 years. And I wanted to touch on loyalty a bit as well, because we actually have seen a general increase in loyalty of those who drink wine in the on-premise. So we consider that as the percentage of consuming wine every time or almost every time. Again, I think we're kind of missing some of the indexes here. So if we look at still wine, sparkling, dessert, sweet wine, the loyalty amongst still wine drinkers who drink it almost every time they visit is quite high. And actually, we've seen this improve year on year since 2024. They're becoming more loyal in this space. I guess the challenge is, as we said before, they're probably a bit less engaged with the on-premise channel versus other category drinkers. So RTD, cocktails, beer, spirits drinkers, they all rank much higher than wine in terms of that high-frequency weekly on-premise visitors as well. So we're becoming more loyal to existing wine drinkers, but they are sort of a less percentage of those that go out into the on-premise really frequently. So that's a challenge, right, that we need to think about and how to overcome in the on-premise. And so, again, for wine, the percentage of occasions where they consume it is more in that sort of formal occasion, special occasion, relaxed, quiet drinks. These are the sort of infrequent occasions. They're the low volume occasions as well. As we move further to the right, these become more high volume, highly frequently visited occasions as well. And more dominated by different categories as well. If you think about after-work drinks, watching live sports, very much beer occasions as well. And as we said before, the biggest drop of share of overall occasions has been that special occasion. And also probably impacting something like champagne and their performance in the on-premise as well. So it paints a really tough picture, right, for the challenge that wine has to achieve. You know, the occasions are lower frequency, low consumption. Younger consumers are out more, but we're not appealing to them as much. So we need to consider what are the factors that people make decisions on how they choose wine, and also what are the big barriers and how do we overcome those as well. And so that is where the strategy needs to lie and how you appeal to consumers, considering both. Pretty typically, price is always a massive factor across all categories, and you have to get that right versus for all consumers to be able to appeal to them. But as we go down, type of wine, varietal, again, are highly important in the on-premise. And that's why you can see, I guess, with those three factors, typically how a wine list is sort of laid out for consumers in a venue, right? You go from type of wine, you have varietal, then you have pretty typically the price from low to high. It makes a lot of sense on how consumers navigate that wine list and their journey as well. But other interesting factors are things like the country of origin and that localization piece, that provenance piece that we talked about before with Australian wine. And we are big consumers of Australian wine. So those do factor in quite a bit into the decisions when out choosing wine. I guess the generational difference is important as well, and I think this talks to some of those kind of conversational Q&A pieces the Endeavour team were talking about. For younger demographics, so under 55, it over-indexes in what dish it goes with, its alcohol content as well, and then also the appeal of that bottle and label design as well. So very different factors that over-index versus the typical on-premise visitor. So those are things that we need to appeal more to for this younger cohort to get them into that wine journey and into consuming wine in the on-premise. Whereas the older, plus 55 demographics, much more important, the varietal, the type of wine, and that country of origin as well. And we see from a localization perspective that country of origin matters a lot less, I guess, to the younger generation. And so when we talk about that localization piece, we are actually seeing an increased preference for localization. But again, this is all coming from an increased preference from older demographics in the on-premise, that plus 55. And that appeal of local brands is not as strong in terms of preferring local versus international brands. So now we have a challenge as well with imported wines, with imported categories, being for our consumers being much more open to that in the on-premise. But compared to 12 months ago, as we kind of said, it's becoming increasingly more important to them, driven by that older group. And that's across all categories, but if we think specifically about wine and how that fits within this space, it really holds a great weight for consumers in wine and beer in terms of how they prioritise brands as well. And we can see that, I guess, coming through with, the preference in total sales number and total volume of Australian consumption in wine. Less so when it comes to spirits, and I guess rum ranks quite highly there, being an Australian spirit that we produce a lot of as well. I think a really interesting one is that a lot of consumers who drink wine do it across both channels, right? They do it through off and on-premise. Although for me, the really interesting number on this slide is in terms of where those consumers who exclusively drink wine at home versus in the on-premise. And what we see with that 23% there is the number of consumers that only drink wine at home. And that's quite a big difference between the number of consumers who only drink wine in the on-premise, right? So it's really interesting that we can capture these consumers at home. They're willing to have it with a meal with family and friends at home, but not willing to go out and have that as a drink of choice in the on-premise. And when we look at the difference between this consumer of the off-premise wine drinker and the on-premise wine drinker, there's some pretty clear differences. So that on-premise wine drinker is more likely to be older. They're more likely to visit the on-premise less frequently. And then also they're more likely from a gender perspective to be female. So the off-premise consumer who is drinking wine but not going into the on-premise and doing it is a younger male consumer who visits the on-premise. So they're a real challenge, and they're more likely to go to a category like beer, spirits, RTDs when it comes to this channel. So I think also interesting to talk about the barriers again. So how do we overcome these? How do we create strategies that overcome these with our brands? In the on-premise, the reasons for currently not drinking, taste and flavour ranks really highly. So it's unapproachable for a lot of consumers from that taste and flavour profile versus our other alcoholic beverages. It's too expensive. That value piece comes up again and again. And also the preference for other categories, beer, spirits, RTDs, also really important. And when we think about this from different younger generations as well, there's a bit of social cachet in it. My friends don't drink it. Maybe they don't see it on social media. It's not something that provides as much social cachet for them. They don't feel as knowledgeable about it. There's that real barrier to understanding the category. Those category entry points that I think Paul talked about earlier aren't there for them through that knowledge and education. They don't know where to start. It's overwhelming. It's confusing for them as well. And I find this one really interesting that it's not offered at the venues I regularly visit. I would say pretty much any on-premise licensed venue in Australia would sell a wine. And the fact that they don't know it's there is really interesting, that they perceive those venues not to have that offer in any way. And so that visibility, that mental availability for consumers, for younger consumers, isn't there for wine. They're not seeing it from their social peers. They're not seeing it from a venue perspective. And even to get started for them, it's a real challenge in the on-premise as well. But when we move on to the 35, 54-year-olds, probably a bit more of an understanding about the category, but they're still overwhelmed by the options, right? Simplicity of choice isn't there for them. It's really difficult in terms of selection. And these are the average consumers, right? For people like us that know a lot more about wine, maybe it is a bit easier. But when you look at the average consumer in Australia, it is a tough category to navigate. Health and well-being factors come in for these guys as well. So it's high in calories they perceive. And then the ABV is too low. So this interesting health and well-being piece where we're looking for a higher ABV product. Are they over-index in that? But it's too high in calories. It's a really strange combination. And that mindful consumption, that moderation, it comes to life in a lot of different ways from a health and well-being perspective. I wanted to give a few examples of stuff that I think are really great examples of how some brands are trying to address this category challenge. The first one is this Mullet brand. I think it's a new one from Fourth Wave Wine. Having chatted to the team there, it was specifically designed to take on the likes of Hard Solo. It's a higher ABV wine. It's got packaging that really appeals to a younger generation. It's got a bit of a cheeky name as well. The amount of mullets we see with younger people this day, it makes sense. And then, I think it tries to simplify that sort of understanding of wine for those consumers. Excuse me. The rosé there, look, I think this is an interesting example of how younger consumers think about wine. It's known as the chicken wine in the UK. And so not that it's to be paired with chicken, but I think there's a big thing around how consumers instantly see something like that and go to food, right? So they're looking for those kind of recommendations on what works with the kind of food-led occasion I have in the on-premise. And often we see, and probably more often we see, that food is kind of the main driver in a lot of those occasions. The quality of food, what they choose first is food rather than the wine. So real simplicity in that wine pairing is a key part of that. We've often talked in our business about, it'd be great to see a wine supplier in that mainstream space release a steak wine rather than a varietal, or a chicken wine, which we think is a really interesting concept. And then that redesigns the whole experience from an on-premise perspective, redesigns the layout of the menu, to think about how consumers navigate that. And that's a lot of work we do into understanding how people make choices and those decisions they make as they sort of navigate venues as well. We're seeing experimentation, I guess, with ABV levels. Mid-strength is a massive trend across the alcoholic beverage industry in Australia. Some of the biggest beers are from mid-strength offerings, and wines are trying to do the same thing. Excuse me. The Bagnum's been talked about a bit, not such an on-premise trend, but again, making it convenient, making it accessible to consumers. And then the last one for me I found really interesting was this Poco Vino. I think it's just launched in the UK from Australian Vintage and launching here in Australia soon. It doesn't have much descriptions on the winemaking. It's really simple in terms of the varietals. It's a new, smaller packaging. It looks like a lipstick, right? Like it looks like skincare products that you can fit into your bag. It's 187 mils. And I think this is really interesting in how they're addressing some of these barriers to the wine category from a Gen Z perspective, from a younger generation perspective as well. So just some examples. And if we think about some of these kind of emerging trends in the on-premise that are coming through, there's a couple of top ones that we're seeing. So food and wine pairing experiences, so going on just recommendations, but how can you create immersive experiences in this space is really top. Wine, cocktails and spritzes, that innovation in sort of how the drink comes to life, what it's mixed with, that spritz trend, we have seen a lot of that. And then emerging Australian wine region. regions as well. But what we see is actually with the younger generations, and again, it's harder to see with the white on the grey there, but the 18 to 34-year-olds really over-index in a lot of these emerging trends in wines. But as you move to the older generations, really it's just all about the local emerging trends for them, emerging wine regions for them. That's the only one that really over-indexes with them. The 18 to 30-year-olds, 34-year-olds really interested in some of these new trends, and they're probably a more prolific consumer of different categories, much more willing to experiment, to move around in the on-premise than the older generations as well. So I think that's something that really could make wine more appealing to these generations, is some of that innovation in this space to address that as well. We've talked about the spritzers as well. Actually 38% of consumers in our survey say they're very likely to choose a spritz when visiting the on-premise. Now that's massive to me in a category that feels quite new or quite underdeveloped. It over-indexes particularly with those under 55, and when we get to the plus 55, it's much lower. So only 23% of that generation are very likely to choose that category. And so again, it shows that innovation in wine coming through with spritzers is really appealing to a younger generation in the on-premise. They can have that category entry point of something from a flavour and a taste perspective that's much more palatable to them. And it can also, for you as suppliers, start that journey for those consumers into the wine category that previously is being more dominated by beer and spirits. But more broadly than this, the cocktail drinker in the on-premise is much more engaged in this channel. They're younger, they're that 18 to 34-year-old willing to spend $20 on a cocktail. They're visiting the on-premise much more frequently. There's a higher proportion of those who are weekly visitors. They're more female as well. And they're the ones that are consuming in these high-intensity occasions like high-tempo drinks. Cocktails are the number one consumed category in high-tempo drinks by a long way there, if you look at some of the other types of categories that are consumed, and particularly against still wine, sparkling wine, and other wines in that occasion. And I think Aperol Spritz has done a lot to drive this. It's been a brand that's really put a lot of investment, a lot of consistency in their marketing to grow this category trend as well. But it's always partnered with the sparkling or Prosecco, right? That's the key to the Aperol Spritz. So how do we kind of think about, the opportunity that lies with sort of pushing a brand? And I think Aperol has done a really great job of this in the market in the on-premise with that consistency of serve, that easy to mix, and really sort of out there bright branding that they've done. And a lot of what we talked about with that category entry point with spritzers comes to life in the data as well. It's a refreshing category. It's easy to drink. Those are the big factors that allow these younger consumers to say, yes, I will sort of pick up a spritz versus a wine in the on-premise. But we can't also forget, I guess, the ABV levels as well. And really interestingly, I'm drinking less alcohol overall is the number one reason for consumers drinking less in still and sparkling at the moment. So it does present an alternative ABV level from a spritz perspective versus wine as well. I think thinking about that brand collaboration, we're seeing a lot of this in the RTD category, right? So is there a learning that can be taken from this space for wines as well? The partnerships we're seeing at a massive level with international spirits brands, with things like Coca-Cola and Sprite there. But we have seen a few sort of glimmers of this in Australia, right? The Crozen on Vintage partnered with 78 Degrees to create sort of that botanical infused sparkling wine. We're seeing wine-based cocktails coming through with brands like Beatbox Drinks and Buzzballs as well, which I know are launching globally and doing really well. So how do you take the wine base and really create something completely new from that? And then, some of these brand partnerships with mixer brands like Fever Tree, who's partnered with Mirabeau to launch a rosé spritz. So we're starting to see that in the wine category as well. And this brand partnership can really leverage the equity of other brands to grow the category as well. And because it's the on-premise, I always like to finish with something about the serve style. Probably a bit of an interesting topic from how you can serve the operators a bit more effectively as well. They're looking for ways to improve their efficiency of operations, to reduce costs, and to appeal to younger consumers as well, or different kinds of consumers. And actually, we see a large proportion of on-premise consumers saying they would find tap or draft wine appealing, right, or very appealing as well. And this, again, over-indexes for that younger generation. So there is a bit of a factor to consider with operations, with operators, and how you can provide solutions outside of just your wine to those operators to make their job easier, to deliver on their needs as well. So really always important to think about the operators at the end of the day. So I guess to sum up, look, the wine is very popular in the on-premise. There's a lot of challenges right now with overall engagement. I guess quite stagnant in the category in on-premise. It's typically a sort of a treat-led and formal occasion, which we're seeing sort of limited growth in. And 1 in 4 wine consumers don't actually even drink it in the on-premise at this point in time. So that's a massive opportunity, right, to convince those to drink it in that channel as well. But there's a lot of barriers, and we, particularly around taste, flavour, price, and preferring other categories. So there is a job to be done there to provide them with options that appeal to them. Sparkling and dessert wine, we've seen a big change in this category, particularly sparkling wine and the engagement in the on-premise. So we need to rethink, I guess, about the listings, the space that's allocated towards these types of products as we see more growth from a consumer perspective. Education is really important, right? But simplifying this message for consumers also is a real challenge as well. So we don't go too technical and we can still appeal to that consumer. Spritz serves is such a dynamic and interesting piece of the wine industry at the moment in Australia. I guess we can't be too precious about how wine is consumed. We need to think about how do we serve the consumer, how do we serve what they're really looking for in the on-premise, in more everyday occasions, in a place, in a sort of a format that's more appealing potentially to the on-premise consumer. And then finally, how do you improve operations for on-premise partners, for your operators? How do you think about the serve style of what's happening with your drinks as well? Is an important way to sort of potentially appeal to more consumers within the wine space as well. So that's all for me today. Sorry, very quick on the on-premise. But if you ever want to get in touch, feel free to contact me. And also, if you wanted to provide a bit of feedback, we are a data company at Nielsen IQ. So I always like to hear from you and your feedback of today's session. But yeah, that's all for me. So thank you very much.